Jesus began speaking to the chief priests and the elders of the people in parables. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a feast for his son's wedding. He sent his servants to call those who'd been invited, but they would not come. Next he sent some more servants. "Tell those who've been invited," he said, "that I have my banquet all prepared. My oxen and fattened cattle have been slaughtered. Everything is ready. Come to the wedding." But they were not interested. One went off to his farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his servants, maltreated them, and killed them. The king was furious. He dispatched his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burnt their town. Then he said to his servants, "The wedding is ready, but as those who were invited proved to be unworthy, go to the crossroads in the town and invite everyone you can find to the wedding." So these servants went out onto the roads and collected together everyone they could find, bad and good alike, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. When the king came in to look at the guests, he noticed one man who was not wearing a wedding garment, and said to him, "How did you get in here, my friend, without a wedding garment?" And the man was silent. Then the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and throw him out into the dark, where there will be weeping and grinding of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." I don't suppose the king would have too much trouble filling his wedding hall these days. He'd be limited to 20 guests. And he'd be more worried about people wearing face masks than wedding garments. But just like the vineyard in the parable we listened to last Sunday, the wedding feast is another of those symbols that would be immediately identifiable to everyone who heard Jesus tell the story. The wedding feast, the wedding banquet, is one of the traditional symbols for the kingdom of heaven. And everyone listening to this parable would know that Jesus was talking about heaven. And just like the parable in last week's story, in last week's gospel, was to be interpreted as a warning to the chief priests and the elders that their stewardship of the people was to be taken from them, so too there's a warning in this story of the invitation to the wedding feast, to the banquet. The warning's even more stark, that last week they were being threatened with losing their stewardship of the people. But this week, they're warned that they are in danger of losing the very kingdom itself. And there is a greater sense of urgency. Last week, they were threatened with losing the parable threatened them with losing their stewardship, their tenancy of the vineyard. But in the parable that we've just listened to, they lose their right, they lose their place in the wedding feasts, the wedding banquet of heaven. That's taken from them completely. So there is a greater sense of urgency, a greater need to respond to the invitation that we are given by God. But that's not where the parable ends. There's a second warning. That's the one I'm less comfortable with. It's the story of the wedding guest who is invited to the wedding, who gets into the banquet, but then is thrown out, bound hand and foot, into the darkness of the night. I always feel sorry for him. There he was, minding his own business, sitting around at the crossroads, with no thoughts of weddings, when he's dragged, without any prior warning, to the wedding feast. And he's there and he's just beginning to settle down and tuck into the cucumber sandwiches and glasses of Buck's Fizz, when someone says, "You're not dressed for a wedding." Out you go. He didn't even have time to change. But that too is a distraction, a misunderstanding. Just as the banquet of heaven is a traditional symbol for the kingdom of God, so too the wedding garment has a symbolic meaning. To everybody who heard that parable, heard Jesus tell that story originally, it's a meaning that's lost on us these days. But originally, the wedding garment would be seen as those acts of generosity that would be expected of every faithful Jew. That someone thinks they can enter the banquet of heaven, the kingdom of heaven, and not reach out in love to others is the second warning that that parable gives. And I suppose that parable leaves me with a couple of questions that I would want to think about. The first is about my attentiveness and responsiveness to God's invitation. God's invitations, because God invites and reminds us of the invitation over and over again. Do I listen to God's call in my life? Do I listen to God's invitation to produce the appropriate fruits, the fruits of kindness and generosity and love? Or do I ignore them? Do I distract myself from them? Listen to other voices? But worse is the second question. Do I try and fool myself into thinking that I've already responded to God's invitation? I've become a Christian, and that's my response, and that's enough. Because it's not. Christianity isn't a badge to be worn. It's not a club to which we belong. It's a way of life. And it's a way of life that involves loving our enemies, reaching out to those on the margins of our society, taking risks to speak up for peace and justice, being merciful and forgiving and loving of enemy and neighbor alike. That's the response. That's the fruit that the gospel last week called for. That's the wedding garment that we are to wear. We are blessed because we have heard God's invitation to share in the wedding banquet. And we've already responded, started at least to respond to that call. But that invitation is given 1,000 times a day. In each act of kindness, we have an opportunity to perform. Each time we recognize the need in someone that we can satisfy. Each person who is hungry that we can feed, naked or we can clothe, sick and we can visit. These are the invitations that God gives and the opportunities He gives to respond. May we be attentive to God's invitation to join in the banquet of heaven. May we listen to His voice each day and respond to it with love wholeheartedly.